Hello again. Hope you're doing well. I'm Hardleg Joe, if you didn't know, and today I'd like to talk to you about human nature. That's a term that gets thrown around a lot when people talk about changing our society. Oftentimes, when someone suggests an idea to improve our government or our economic system, it's met with statements like, well, that's a good idea on paper, but it'll never work in practice because it goes against human nature. Which begs the question, what exactly is human nature? Because there doesn't really seem to be any consensus between people. Some think that humans are naturally social, kind, or creative. Others think us naturally violent, destructive, or greedy. There's a lot of different conflicting answers, largely because human nature is usually based more on opinion than science. Most people who invoke that term are just looking at their society and assuming it must be natural. That how people act right now is how they have always acted, and how they always will act. Which is not true, but I understand how they reach that conclusion. If you've grown up in a certain environment all your life, then that environment is going to feel natural to you. And anything different is going to feel unnatural. That's why it's important to have a broad historical perspective when it comes to human nature. A couple hundred years ago, there were people who thought that monarchy was a natural system. Look back at the Age of Revolution when a lot of countries were trying to switch from kings to constitutions, and you'll find educated people who are arguing against it. Because back then, large-scale democratic governments were only theoretical. And a lot of otherwise intelligent people thought that those theories only worked on paper. Many of them claimed that the idea of democracy clashed with human nature, that most people could not handle freedom, and that civilization would collapse within a few years without an absolute monarch to guide it. And that's just one example. Go back even further in time, and you'll find the same argument being made about slavery. The philosopher Aristotle thought that some people were just naturally slave-like, that they were better off being property, and that it was just human nature for society to have a large class of slaves. And many of his contemporaries agreed with him. For hundreds and hundreds of years, mass slavery was the default system, and many people could not imagine their world working without it. Now, of course, we've grown up without absolute monarchs or institutional slavery. So the idea that society needs those systems to function is almost laughable. We know for a fact that democratic countries made up of free people are perfectly capable of running themselves. Because that's what most countries are doing right now. What most countries have been doing for hundreds of years at this point. But that's the thing. It only seems obvious to us because we've lived that experience. It feels natural because it's been that way all our lives. But if you were living under a monarchy that had lasted 500 years, you'd be far less certain that democracy could work. You'd probably be more than a bit skeptical about changing the system that runs your entire life. My point is, notions about human nature have changed dramatically over the centuries. And it's really easy to see that most of those notions were just products of their time. Nobles thought that most humans were naturally passive peasants because they lived under feudalism, where most people had to be peasants. The ancient Greeks thought slaves were natural because there were slaves everywhere, man. Their bias is really obvious in hindsight, and yet most people now don't apply that same perspective to their own time. They see our current political and economic systems with all their glaring flaws and conclude that those systems must be the natural order of things. That any other system is doomed to failure because it flies in the face of human nature. Which is clearly not true. History has showed us that human nature is not so specific that it includes theories of finance. Our preferred system of government is not hard-coded into our DNA. If it was, then history wouldn't have such diverse and changing cultures. Like, think of it this way. Humans naturally have two hands, right? Like, sure, some people are born without their hands, and maybe some people have extra hands, but the vast, overwhelming majority of us just have the two. And that hasn't changed since the dawn of humanity. In this case, you can safely conclude that it's natural for humans to have two hands. But there is no universal government system. There is no standard economic model. Those elements have changed drastically from place to place, have evolved continuously with time and technology. Which means they are not part of our nature. Because that's the thing, right? If you want to say something is natural to humans, then it has to apply to nearly all humans. It has to be true for just about everyone who has ever lived. And while you could certainly claim that for basic physical traits like having 2 eyes and 10 fingers, there's very few behaviors that meet that requirement. There's only 2 that I can think of, and they are very, very broad. So much so that they might not even be exclusive to humans. That being said, if human nature does exist, it is these 2 traits. We adapt, and we survive. That's it. Any other broad trait you want to assign to humanity can be explained as a product of those 2 core ideals. For example, a lot of people think humans are naturally social. But I've heard from enough loners and introverts to know that isn't necessarily true. And it seems to be getting less true as technology improves. If given the option, I think a lot of us would choose to live lives of relative solitude. Our tendency towards being social is an adaptation. It's something we developed to help us survive. Because for the entire history of our species, groups of humans have always done better and lived longer than lone individuals. That's why we have cities and countries in the first place. The more people you have working together, the stronger they become, and the easier it is for all of them to survive. Picking another example, it's often said that humans are naturally kind and constructive. And while I certainly like those traits, they too are a survival technique. As I just pointed out, humans do best when they live in groups, and in a group situation, it is advantageous to be kind and help create things. Hateful, destructive people are a danger to the group. And if humans think you're endangering their survival, they will not hesitate to eliminate you. So it is in our own best interest to be kind and constructive, to help the group rather than hinder it. Be nice to those around you, and you'll find that you have allies in survival. Be mean towards them, and you'll find yourself surrounded by life-threatening enemies. Now, of course, sometimes a group of people becomes so large and so powerful that enemies are no longer a threat to them. They can easily defeat anyone who opposes them, which means there's no longer consequences for being hateful and destructive, so long as it's aimed outside of the main group. In that situation, violence becomes the optimal survival strategy. Because a powerful group can use violence to steal whatever it wants without much risk to itself. Now, if that violent group is a civilization, then it'll probably be warlike and imperialistic, using its military to dominate less powerful nations. As a result, its population will likely think that being violent is human nature. Because to them, it's natural to kill and destroy. That's what they do to survive, and it works very well for them. In many ways, the Roman Empire was like that. Much of its grandeur was built on the back of endless warfare and conquest. But it's important to recognize that their path towards civilization wasn't universal. At the same time that they were building an empire through bloodshed, leaders in India were preaching pacifism. Not only towards humans, but towards animals as well. And I think that's partially because India could not afford to be warlike. The country is surrounded on all sides by mountains and desert and ocean, all of which would have been very difficult to cross in ancient times. As a result, the only large-scale war that India could wage back then was civil war, which would have devastated their civilization. So instead, they focused on peaceful coexistence, on a society built of pacifism, because that was the best way to survive in their situation. I could go on, but I think you get the point. Human beings, taken as a whole, do not have a natural temperament. We are not born with a desire to create or destroy, to love or to hate. Our nature is merely to survive. And because we can adapt to almost any situation, we will become whatever our environment requires of us. That's why the systems and conditions we live under are so important, because they affect how society as a whole will act. Think of it like this. If you trapped a big group of humans on a desert island with nothing to eat, those people would eventually eat each other. That doesn't mean that cannibalism is human nature. It means someone created a situation where cannibalism was those people's only chance of survival. Likewise, if you trap people in a system where they need money to survive, those people will do literally anything to get money. And they won't stop even when they have a lot. If that same system requires them to compete against their fellow citizens to get the money, then they will see most people as obstacles to their survival, as enemies to be defeated or cattle to be herded in. That doesn't mean that it's human nature to be greedy. That doesn't mean humans are naturally selfish or competitive. It means that we live in a system where being greedy, being selfish and competitive is the optimal survival strategy. And the only reason it seems natural to you is because you've grown up in that system. Change the system, and you change how people will act. Reward cooperation and kindness. Make it so that the optimal survival strategy is for all of us to work together, and people will adapt to their new paradigm. Maybe not immediately, change is always difficult, but we can change. We've done it before. And if we do, then the next generation, the people born under that system, will see it as the natural order of things. Those people will gladly work together for their mutual benefit, and they will look back at how we used to live now and wonder why we would tolerate it, much less defend it. Now, if you didn't know already, this video is actually a follow-up to a previous one I did, titled Economic Democracy. There, I explained some of the flaws with our current economic system, and proposed some changes that would make it better. At the end of that video, I asked viewers to give me some reasons as to why my proposal might not work, to tell me what would prevent us from making it reality. As you could probably guess, I got a few mentions of human nature, though it was usually phrased in a roundabout way as questions about motivation. How could I expect people to work together when humans are naturally competitive? How could I expect people to share something when humans are naturally greedy? Why would anyone want to start a business if they could not be the king of that business and rake in money for the rest of their lives? My answer to all of that should be clear by now. We are not born craving money. The motivation to own a business and become extremely wealthy is a learned behavior, something instilled into us by the system we live under. If we altered that system, as I suggested, then the motivations of the people living under it will change with it. In an economic system where everyone plays a part, where the social expectation is to cooperate and profits are shared, then the motive changes from personal wealth to improving the world at large. You start a company because you have a cool product and you want to make it a reality. You start a company because you're unsatisfied with the current service and you think you can do it better. You want to make newer, better things and improve the world because you live in the world. In a society where wealth and power is more evenly distributed, improving that society in any small way directly improves your life as well. There is no older or more universal motivation than that. Now, I realize that my message would probably be most effective if I ended things there, but I do have a few points I need to touch on for the sake of clarity and completeness. This is, after all, a video about human nature, and while I do think there is a general trend that emerges in large groups of humans, I think it's important to recognize that individuals often ignore that trend. Like, I say it's human nature to survive, but some people choose to put their lives at risk for the sake of others, or to preserve some ideal. And some people outright end their lives to escape from situations that they feel they can't adapt to. Whatever the motivation, risking or ending your life is kind of the opposite of surviving, isn't it? Granted, these people are a minority of the total population, but their numbers are large enough and consistent enough that I don't think we can just ignore them entirely. Brave and/or suicidal people have existed since the dawn of time, and their continued presence shows that while we may have some broad underlying nature, even that can be overridden in extreme circumstances. There's also the matter of genetics. Like, everyone has height, but some individuals are significantly taller or shorter than others. And that has little to do with adapting to the environment and a lot to do with their genes. Likewise, while everyone feels a little greedy and aggressive from time to time, there are probably some individuals who are naturally more greedy or naturally more aggressive, and no change to their environment will stamp that out completely. At the end of the day, our society will always have some selfish, destructive people, just like it'll always have tall and short people. That being said, while genetics can resist the environment, it isn't immune to it. Some people may be naturally taller than others, but if you deny them proper nutrition as a child, it will permanently stunt their growth. It doesn't matter how naturally strong you are, If you're malnourished, you're not going to be able to build any muscle mass. That's just physics. I think the same idea holds true for mental traits as well. Some people are naturally nicer than others. But if you put them in a system where nice people get taken advantage of, it will stunt their emotional growth. Regardless of natural disposition, they will end up being colder and more ruthless than they would otherwise. Now, both of those are negative examples where a trait gets diminished by society, but I think the opposite is true as well. Someone born with a weaker constitution can still grow to be strong and healthy as long as they have access to a proper diet and medical care. Likewise, someone born without a lot of kindness or empathy can have those traits boosted by a caring society. Or at the very least, they can be motivated to act kind towards others, even if they don't feel it in their heart. All of this is to say, no system is perfect. No matter how we change things, there will always be some people who are greedy and violent. The aim is not to make a perfect system that magically solves all our problems. It's to craft a system that is better than the one we have now. A system that incentivizes people to be helpful and constructive, and punishes people who are selfish and destructive. In many ways, I think our current world is a lot like ancient India. It is a closed system with no more room to grow and expand. The infrastructure of every state in our country is linked together. The economies of every country in our world are linked together. We need to move away from these competitive, violent systems towards peaceful, cooperative ones, because if we don't, we can only hurt ourselves. We can only tear each other apart. Now, if you've made it this far and you haven't yet watched my video on economic democracy, I would highly encourage you to do so. I'm still planning at least one more follow-up video in the near future, so having that context will be important. For now, though, I think I've covered just about everything I can on human nature. As always, feel free to leave any questions or criticisms down in the comments. I do read those. Thanks for listening, and until next time, stay safe out there.